I'd like to introduce Sonoma Land Trust. We are a local nonprofit that protects land in Sonoma County for futures, generations, and everybody's benefit. We've been doing this work since 1976, and we have protected over 60,000 acres in our county so far, many of these projects through partnerships. We accomplish our work through the generosity of our members, our contributors, and our supporters. So thanks to all of you out there who are helping us to protect beautiful Sonoma County. My background is actually of the Jenner Headlands. It's a very special place to many of us. The lands include Little Black Mountain and Pole Mountain and the Jenner Headlands, but these lands are situated within the ancestral territory of the Kashaya-Pomo. They're a federally recognized tribe who have an intact language and thriving culture today. Sonoma Land Trust has a collaborative partnership with the Kashaya-Pomo to ensure tribal involvement with our land stewardship and land conservation activities on the coast. As we pursue our mission of conserving land in Sonoma County, we recognize that we stand upon the unceded ancestral lands of many Indigenous peoples. We embrace our responsibility to learn from and to protect their cultural and traditional connections to the land. Tribal groups in every region of the county are Sonoma Land Trust's most important partners in the care and stewardship of the ecologically significant lands that we manage. So I'm Shanti Edwards, the Sonoma Coast Program Manager for Sonoma Land Trust, and I'm thrilled to host this conversation about the Cornell Land Trust Bird Conservation Initiative grant that Sonoma Land Trust and our partners spearheaded to evaluate the effects of forest habitat modifications and fuel reduction projects using birds as an indicator of habitat health. Sonoma Land Trust played a lead role in preserving the 6,300 acre conservation landscape, which comprises the Jenner Headlands, Pole Mountain, and Little Black Mountain preserves. And so we also have very long-standing relationships with Point Blue Conservation Science and the Wildlands Conservancy, who really enabled us to acquire the Jenner Headlands and has partnered with us every step of the way. So it was a natural fit for us to seek and coordinate this grant opportunity, which we were eligible for because of our accreditation status. Tonight, you'll be hearing from Ryan DiGaudio from Point Blue Conservation Science and Ryan Berger, the Sonoma Coast Preserve Manager for the Wildlands Conservancy. Ryan DiGaudio has been studying bird populations in Northern California since 1996 and is currently the principal ecologist of the Working Lands group at Point Blue Conservation Science. His work primarily focuses on understanding how bird communities respond to different management and restoration practices, including in woodland settings and on working lands like farms and ranches. Through ecological data collection and monitoring, he helps land managers like Sonoma Land Trust and the Wildlands Conservancy to make informed land stewardship decisions for improved ecological outcomes. Ryan earned a BA in Biology and Environmental Studies from the University of California, Santa Cruz, and a Master's of Science in Resource Ecology and Management from the University in Michigan. And then I'd also like to introduce Ryan Berger, our primary partner with the Wildlands Conservancy. He has dedicated the past 15 years to nonprofit conservation work in Northern California, and he is currently the Sonoma Coast Preserves Manager, which includes the Jenner Headlands and Estero Americano Coast Preserve for the Wildlands Conservancy. Ryan works collaboratively with staff, partners, and community members to provide a unique public access experience, as well as steward the preserve's bountiful natural resources, focusing on forest, coastal prairie, and watershed management practices. Prior to coming on board to the Wildlands Conservancy in 2022, Ryan was a marine ecologist for the Farallon program for Point Blue Conservation Science, and previously he was also the Associate Director of Field Operations and Response for the Marine Mammal Center in Sausalito. And Ryan Berger is going to take it from here.
Thanks so much, Shanti, for that warm welcome. Good evening, everybody. Thanks for joining. Excited to be able to present today, and want to thank Sonoma Land Trust for putting on this speaker series and the invitation to present. I'm going to kick things off and just give a lay of the land and a quick overview of what we'll be covering this evening. We do want to give, again, credit to Cornell Land Trust Bird Conservation Initiative for the opportunity to get this grant, which funded the project, and all the great work that the Cornell Lab of Ornithology does. We'll discuss a little bit about our project partners, how coming together and collaborating, leveraging on our strengths can improve the impacts of the work that we're doing. We'll talk a little bit about fuels management projects at the Jenner Headlands Preserves and the Sonoma Land Trust Preserves, the history, why we have to do forest management, and the current conditions. Then we'll switch over to forest and fuels as habitat, how birds can be great indicators as to the health of that habitat, and draw conclusions and discuss that. Next slide. So I want to speak a little bit to the importance of partnership. And before perhaps diving into the three organizations here, just acknowledgement of Sonoma County itself and how many great agencies and organizations that are here focused on natural resource conservation, whether it be our local county parks, open space district, our resource conservation districts, to the state level of our parks and beaches, to the federal, but focusing here on all of the other nonprofits and specifically Sonoma Land Trust. Our mission statements are listed. You can see that they're very similar, but all the work that we do really makes this a rewarding job, and the collaborative approach that we have coming together and the work that we do focusing on our natural lands make this a beautiful county to live in. A lot of credit to Sonoma Land Trust and Shanti for applying for this grant. They are accredited, which qualified them to be the lead applicant. She did a great job at chasing Ryan and myself down for updates on our projects, for reporting purposes, and for keeping the project moving along when we ran into many hurdles along the way. Point Blue Conservation Science and Ryan DiGaudio and his team obviously provide the bird expertise to come out and do the surveys and allow the birds to tell the story of how our management practices are impacting the overall habitat and ecosystem. And then the Wildlands Conservancy, as one of those partners, along with Sonoma Land Trust in our stewardship efforts, provided the Jenner Headlands, which did a baseline study in 2013 and provided 10-year gap in the end for those comparative surveys to see what the results were after that time lapse. The last point to make is that this is appealing to funders. If the three of us would have competed for this grant and submitted our own proposals, those grant reviewers would have had to go through 3 different proposals, and really coming together as an organization is important to leverage our different strengths. And that's kind of highlighted when we look at this next slide. As you can see here, the ecosystems that we protect, the biodiversity of the plants and animals that rely on them know no boundaries. So we see lines drawn on the map here, but that's not really how we should approach our conservation efforts. Just to provide a little bit of the lay of the land for folks not maybe familiar with California or Sonoma County, we are located about 2 hours north of San Francisco. You follow the Russian River from Highway 101 out to the Pacific Ocean, and it hits Jenner. And here at the Jenner Headlands, we have 5,630 acres of preserved land that joins with the Sonoma Land Trust property at Pole Mountain of 238 acres, and then with Little Black Mountain at 500 acres. And it creates that wildlife corridor and a larger piece of land that we need to preserve. And then if you go to the east, you see another Sonoma Land Trust property, which is the Bear Canyon Wildlands, 250 acres. We're going to dive into some of the details of the forest management practices and the fuels reduction work that we did under the Cal VTP. This is a framework, the California Vegetation Program, and it essentially allows us to move through land stewardship like forest management and make sure that we are complying with the rules and regulations outlined in the California Environmental Quality Act, or CEQA. We also want to, as Shanti did a great job introducing these lands, as the ancestral lands of the Kashai Band of Pomo Indians. We work very closely with them. So when we do each one of these stewardship projects, we make sure that we consult with tribal members leading up to the projects. We have them come out and make sure that we aren't going to impact any artifacts. And then we have a tribal monitor on site when we are conducting these projects in real time to ensure we are making sure that we are meeting their needs as well. Next slide, please. So I think it's important to highlight why we even have to do forest management and the history behind this. Related to the Kashaya that were out here, time immemorial, they were using fire as a management tool. They were using that as a tool to keep the ecosystem in balance, to provide the plants so that they could use it as food and as tools. and to create an overall healthy ecosystem. We started to move away from the use of fire out of the fear of it and more people moving into wild lands. You combine that with 150 years of commercial harvesting, and we get a result that looks like the next slide. So here on the left, this is the Jenner Headlands Preserve, where the coastal prairie and grasslands meet the redwood forest. And in 1947, you can see an intact forest, and not more than 15 years later, in 1960s, there's a near clear cut of that forest. Those results can be seen in the next slide. If we focus in on the photo on the left, what we see is a fairy ring of redwood trees. Historically, there would be one of these old growth redwoods standing in its place, and about 30 of those per acre of land. After clear cutting and harvesting, we now have a fairy ring of 10 trees, which equates to 300 or more of these redwood trees in the forest, which creates a young dense stand. Of course, on the right, after you disturb a forest, which was dominated mostly by redwood and Doug fir, you have other species that can move in. And this photo is showing hardwood, or tan oak, which is also a native species, but it's suffering from sudden oak death syndrome and is causing a lot of these trees to die, fall on the ground, reshaping the forest canopy, and creating increased fuel loads, which has impact on catastrophic fires. Next slide, please. In this slide, we're highlighting the catastrophic fires that have happened in West Sonoma County over the years. So decades ago, starting in the 60s or earlier, up until recently in 2020 with the Walbridge fire, we can see the red lines outline each individual fire, and the shaded gray area is where they burned. The point here is that despite a catastrophic wildfire moving through, these fires are still happening and overlaying one another. And just because a fire has come through before doesn't mean that it's going to happen again. And we need to get back to managing our forests in a sustainable way and reduce those fuel loads to prevent this from happening in the future. Next slide. One of the tools that we use to help manage those fuels in the forest are creating shaded fuel breaks. Our goals for those shaded fuel breaks are to reduce fuel loads 150 feet to either side of our ridgetop roads, keep our large healthy trees, remove ladder fuels, so the understory growth and the brush that's on the forest floor, make sure that the branches on the trees are not touching that so that it allows for the fire to move from the floor to the canopy of the forest. We want to remove smaller trees, but not all of them. We want a succession plan as well. And then use fire in a controlled manner to remove ground fuel from the forest floor. The infographic on the right shows a before and after. And the next slide are photos from one of our project sites. You can see one of our shaded fuel breaks here on the Jenner Headlands. This is located on our East Ridge Road. The pre-treatment photo is on the left, showing a dense, thick understory. And the post-treatment is on the right, where you can see a lot of that understory is removed. The lower limbs and ladder fuels are no longer there. And the ground debris has been burned away as well. Next slide. Another tool that we can use that is more focused on ecological benefits rather than the fuels reduction is a restoration forestry method called thin and release. Here we're trying to restore old growth redwood forest and their characteristics. Those characteristics include higher biodiversity, a mixed age stands of trees within the forest, a healthy soil composition, canopy openings. We do want light to penetrate through and be able to provide sunlight to the forest floor. Various layers of decaying ground matter, topography, and standing snags left behind as habitat for animals. The way we did this was we actually implemented a timber harvest plan This allowed us to take out larger diameter trees in that fairy ring so that we could release some of those resources. We're considering the spacing between trees so that we can allow those larger trees to grow into the space. And we're looking at the long-term productivity of the ecosystem to find that balance for both humans, plants, and animals. The added benefit is that this work also acts as a shaded fuel break. Next slide. This is an example of the methods used for restoration forestry. So again, after that one old growth redwood was cut down, 10 or more resprouts may happen. All of those smaller trees are competing for resources such as sunlight, water, soil nutrients. And by selecting the largest tree and leaving that behind and thinning out some of the other smaller trees, you release those resources so that the bigger trees left behind can get bigger faster and move to a more mature forest stand that we see on the right-hand side. Next slide. Additionally, in a crowded stand, we see the trees that develop tall, slender, and narrow crowns and don't allow for a lot of sunlight to penetrate through to the forest floor. By removing those smaller trees, leaving the larger ones behind, and allowing that sunlight to penetrate through, those bigger trees can reach their big limbs out, start to touch one another, but still allow for the light to come through. And they're a healthier forest overall. Next slide. There is data that backs the benefits to the thin and release method in second growth forests. There's documentation of tree growth in thin plots that had 4 times the growth compared to unthin plots. Documentation of understory shrubs were at the same densities as in old growth stands 30 years after thin and release. And to the point of this project, understory birds had equivalent abundance in thin plots in old growth forest 30 years after thinning. We wanted to take those findings and replicate them here in this project. Next slide. To provide an overview of what type of work and where it's been done, this is a map of the Jenner Headlands Preserve. You can see the outline in green. And we're focusing on that narrow area along our ridgetop roads, so the colored areas. And this is done in a design so that we can have safe ingress and egress for the agencies that are coming to fight catastrophic wildfires and hold the line, as well as to provide safe passage for community members to get out in case they need to escape a fire. The blue area is a shaded fuel break that was established in 2013 through 2018 and totals in roughly 140 acres. We have a longstanding collaboration with CAL FIRE, and there are ongoing prescribed burn units happening along that east ridge. In the red area, we completed the timber harvest plan in 23 through the thin and release method, and we followed up in 2024 with a shaded fuel break in the work of great tree tenders for a total area of 106 acres. In the orange area is the 2024 shaded fuel break, totaling roughly 63 acres. The bird surveys, which Ryan will go into more depth later on, are highlighted in blue and red. Next slide. Hopeful that this video will come through. If it doesn't, I can speak over it. But what it's illustrating is a prescribed fire on the Jenner Headlands, and that it's in a controlled manner. Our battalion chief out here, Marshal Tuberville, really wants people to show up and be bored by these controlled fires. That's the whole point, is that there's nothing really to see here, and that we get back to using these as a tool to reduce the fuel loads overall and avoid the incidents where we run into the catastrophic wildfires of the past. Next slide. In summary, before I hand it off to Shanti to talk about the Sonoma Land Trust preserves, wanted to highlight the partnership of Point Blue, first engaging out here at the Jenner Headlands in 2010 to provide bird and other ecological monitoring data. And if I back up, I really want to give the folks credit who, during the acquisition process, Sonoma Land Trust leading the charge along with a lot of other partners, and embedded into that acquisition money was the foresight to develop an integrated resource management plan that hired technical advisors to look at watershed and riparian habitats, the coastal grasslands and prairies, and the forest, and devise goals of how to manage these, which have provided the blueprint for moving forward. And a lot of that was dependent on collecting data such as birds to use as indicators to inform us on whether or not these management practices were having our intended effect. The initial focus was on the coastal grasslands and grassland birds. And then in 2012 through 2014, monitoring expanded to forest bird communities. 10 years went by, we completed a lot of those forest management practices, and it allowed us a comparative analysis from baseline in 2013 to the more recent surveys conducted in 2023 and 2024. From here, I'll hand it back over to Shanti so she can discuss the Sonoma Land Trust Preserves.
Okay, I'm back. All right, so thank you, Ryan. Building on the great work happening at the Jenner Headlands Preserve, I want to spotlight the work happening to the north of Jenner. And these are the lands called Pole Mountain and Little Black Mountain, which we have a long history with since 1979. This property to the north, Little Black Mountain, was donated to us after the Creighton Ridge fire of 1978. And so the land was shaped by fire and has also shaped many of our practices around maintaining evacuation routes and getting a water storage tank with fire hydrant outlets and creating fire safety plans even before 2017. So the work that we have been doing over the last 20 years is in response to some of the past forest conditions caused by the past logging practices that removed the large diameter trees, the fire that swept through and caused all the resprouting hardwoods. There was a lot of tan oak die-off and just a very dense, thick forest on Little Black Mountain as well as Pole Mountain. And so over the years, we've been chipping away at fuels management primarily along ranch roads because we're thinking about evacuation needs for the local community and allowing for fire response crews to make a stand. And so the fuel break on Pole Mountain actually wraps down to Duncan's Mills through the Jenner Headlands and then down through another forest community. So it actually carves off the communities of Jenner and Duncan's Mills and those areas so that there is a unit by which we could protect those rural neighbors. So we've done a lot of fuels management work at Little Black Mountain. It was about 39 acres. You can see the plots in like purple and green and yellow. And then on Pole Mountain, we did some work in 2021, and that was about a dozen acres. So over the years, we've been chipping away at these same areas, but in 2023, we scaled up with the fuels management at Little Black Mountain when we started to connect parallel roads and think about future burn units and focusing on areas like hairpin turns where we could use the ranch roads and old legacy skid roads to create these burn areas. And so let's go to the next slide. I think I have, okay, so here we have some pictures of the pre-treatment conditions. And so similar to what Ryan Berger talked about, our tools are really like forest thinning, where we're taking out these small diameter trees that you can see in these photos. We're pruning up the ladder fuels on the larger diameter retention trees. And then also we have to do something with all the biomass. And so that's actually the big question in fuels management, is what to do with all that fuel. And so in the past, over the last 20 years, we've been doing lop and scatter. So that's a practice of putting the material down on the ground with the intention of letting it decompose over time. And, you know, these lands typically get a lot of rain in the winter, but this material was not decomposing. And so we've got that's why we need to burn this material to make it safer for and reduce fire intensity when wildfire does come. So you can see in the historic aerial, this is of Pole Mountain. It was, you know, blanketed in areas of like tall conifers. And then after the logging where you see the skid roads and then the Creighton Ridge fire, it just was like a stand replacing event where everything got reset. So let's go to the next slide. So these are some of our burn units, and you can see we had the excitement of fire on the ground in 2023 and 2024. We also in let's see, yeah, 20, I can't get my years straight, but we've been working in waves preparing these units, and we're pivoting to more of a pile burning approach to consume the fuels in a more focused and targeted manners. And there's a lot more to say about fuels management on the coast and the techniques with fuels management, but I'm going to actually turn it over to Ryan DiGaudio to talk about the bird monitoring. Thank you. Sorry, I was so excited about the coast properties. I forgot to mention the Bear Canyon Wildlands. We added this property to the study because we wanted to contrast the coastal lands with the interior, more fire-prone areas, and look at birds as an indicator of habitat health in these inland drier forests. And so this fuel break is on one of the land trust preserves in the eastern part of the county. And this was a big legacy fuel break that was used in the Kincaid fire defense. And Ryan is going to talk more about the findings there. Now I'm handing it to Ryan. Thank you.
Thank you, Shanti. And thank you, Ryan Berger, both of you guys for setting the stage. Tough acts to follow, I will say. And now I hope technology doesn't fail me, so just bear with me. I'm gonna hide, I have to hide this control bar for Zoom, otherwise I can't see my slides. Okay, so just shifting gears a little bit. I just thought it'd be good to start off by trying to get you all thinking like a bird and thinking about what birds need in their natural history. And, I don't know about you all, you're probably, you're all nature lovers, so you probably know a lot more about birds than the average person. But when I talk to, people who aren't, you know, people who don't study nature or pay attention, they all think birds nest in trees. Like, oh, the birds are up in the trees. And yeah, that's what a lot of birds do, like American robins. But a lot of birds, and in some locations, I would say most birds nest on or near the ground in the forest understory. And that's something that was always in the front of my mind going into this project, because a lot of these fuels management activities really impact the understory, and they're really changing the structure down there. And so that's going into it. My hypothesis was that this was going to affect the understory birds. And just as a pointing or an example, when I was doing surveys on Jenner headlands back in around 2010 or 2012, the earlier forest surveys before they did any of the treatments, I stumbled upon this nest that was nestled at the base of a sword fern clump at the base of a redwood tree along one of the roads. And I believe it was a Wilson's warbler nest, and Wilson's warblers, that's the little yellow bird in the lower right of your screen. They're one of our neotropical migrants that flies thousands of miles each spring, coming up from Mexico, Central America, maybe parts of South America, coming up to our area to nest and raise their kids and start the new generation of Wilson's warblers. So yeah, with that in mind, just wanted to back up a little bit about why we should pay attention to the birds in the first place. I mean, it's worth paying attention to the birds for the birds' sakes, for sure, but why should we look at birds specifically as indicators of ecological health? Well, they're the proverbial canaries in the coal mine. Though we're not looking at individual birds in cages like the canary in the coal mine, but entire bird communities. Because by looking at what species comprise the bird communities and what each species is doing with its population, whether their numbers are going up or down, can tell you about the condition of the ecosystem. And because birds respond relatively fast to ecological change, over a matter of a few years, their populations can shift and respond And they can respond in real time too if the habitat conditions change so rapidly that it no longer suits them, or if the habitat changes to where it actually suits them better, you're going to see more of a particular species move in. But why focus on birds and not, say, other animals that might be using this ecosystem? Well, they are compared to a lot of other animals, like nocturnal mammals that can be hard to monitor. Reptiles and amphibians can be hard to find, and insects hard to identify. Birds are highly visible compared to these other animals, and they're also they announce their presence. They're audible. They're singing and calling all day long, and so that makes them relatively easy, which means cost effective to monitor, especially with standardized protocols. Additionally, birds are relatively charismatic, and the people uh, like birds. A lot of people like birds. And so that just helps can you can engage people in nature through birds. I've often heard of birders say that birds were like sort of their gateway into getting into nature, and then from there they went in and got into other aspects of nature, and into conservation. So birds are popular. Another good reason. Um, and this last point, monitoring a suite of focal species that have different ecological requirements that can be used to guide management and evaluate management practices. And to expand a little more, the focal species approach to conservation and conservation planning. Um, A carefully selected suite of focal species should represent the range of critical ecosystem elements. For example, some species require understory habitat, other species are found in the canopy, and others are found in the mid-canopy. And a suite of focal species, or a collection of focal species, um, should include species at risk, like your T&E species or special status species, but also umbrella species. So an umbrella species is one that if you're managing the habitat for that one species, you're also managing the habitat for many other species that fall under its umbrella. But lastly, and most importantly, focal species should include common species. Everyday birds, because those are the species that you're going to be able to track trends in more easily, because you can get really good sample sizes of these common birds. And so taken all together, the presence and abundance of focal species is kind of like a ecological barometer for the condition of your ecosystem, and can be used to evaluate forest management practices. And I'll also say that this focal species approach has been embraced by the bird conservation world, in particular by Partners in Flight, especially California Partners in Flight. Partners in Flight, if you're not familiar, it's a consortium or a partnership of bird conservationists that include government agencies, state, federal, local, land managers, land management agencies, scientists, academics, NGOs, nonprofits, individual landowners, anybody who wants to work towards conserving bird populations. And this illustration was taken directly from the California Partners Flight Riparian Bird Conservation Plan. And so it just gives you an idea of how each of the focal species occupy a different space, a different niche in that ecosystem. So for example, at the bottom, you have spotted towhees that nest on the ground in the forest understory. And then up in the trees, you've got birds like the Swainson's hawk that put their nests up there. Now, for designing this project and thinking about how we are going to see how birds responded to forest management at the Jenner Headlands Preserve, but also at the three Sonoma Land Trust preserves, Pole Mountain, Little Black Mountain, and Bear Canyon Wildlands, we selected we kind of came up with our own custom list, but we didn't come up with these species out of thin air. For the first requirement was that these were species known to occur on the preserves. Secondly, we selected focal species that had already been identified as focal species for these ecosystems from two existing bird conservation plans. Those were the California Partners in Flight Coniferous Bird Conservation Plan and also the Oregon-Washington Partners in Flight Western Conifer Bird Conservation Plan. Because the Oregon-Washington Coniferous Bird Conservation Plan actually more closely aligned to the coastal coniferous forests we have in Sonoma County. And in addition, we included the State Wildlife Action Plan regional focal species. So altogether, we ended up with something like 25 focal species, and this slide shows just it shows most of the focal species, but I could not get all the focal species in one table that would show it a slide. But these are I think, the most relevant ones. And we could spend a long time, I could spend a long time geeking out over all the information here, but I'll just point out the first two columns next to the bird names. If the first one is if they have any special conservation status, if they're federally threatened, like the northern spotted owl is, that's the third species down, or if they're in the State Wildlife Action Plan, as are the spotted owl, Vox's swift, and also olive-sided flycatcher. Vox's swift and olive-sided flycatcher are also bird species of special concern. That's what BSSC means. Then the next column indicates which conservation plan they are in. Some of them are in both. And then the next three columns are just provide some natural history information, which tells you a little bit about what these birds need for their nesting ecology and also their foraging and overall life history ecology. And the main thing that I'll call out here, the ones we wanted to pay most closely attention to were the understory species. And so the highlighted ones here, mountain quail, Pacific slope flycatcher, Pacific wren, hermit thrush, Wilson's warbler, and dark-eyed junco. And there were a couple other understory species that just aren't in this table, like California quail, for example. Now to go over what it is we did, I'm happy to share the details and nuances of each of these protocols if anybody's interested, but I'll try to keep it brief. At Jenner Headlands, we used 5-minute point counts in 3 treatment areas. And Ryan Berger discussed this, showed a slide and talked about this a little bit. But the main areas, if you look over at the map on the right, we had the Western Shaded Fuel Break, the WSB in my abbreviation, and then the Eastern Shaded Fuel Break on the right side, which is ESB, with the yellow points overlaid. And then these green points that are just in the non-highlighted forest, abbreviated URG, those are the Upper Russian Gulch. That's the Upper Russian Gulch area where some thin and release restoration forestry occurred. And as Ryan mentioned, we did baseline surveys at these sites in 2013 and 2014. And then fast forward 10 years, we returned in 23 and 24 to repeat the surveys after a lot of management had happened. And then going over to the Sonoma Land Trust preserves, we used a different protocol called the area search method. And in which we overlaid a survey plot with the treatment area. So the shaded areas, the shaded polygons, are where the various forest treatments occurred. The shaded fuel breaks, the scatter. No, I can't remember the term Shanti used, but lop and scatter, and so we did surveys in each of those plots before and after the treatments occurred. And it's important to point out that all of these surveys occurred during what we consider the peak of the nesting season for these birds. So we're really focused on the nesting bird community using these sites. And that's in May and June. And so for the Sonoma Land Trust preserves, we did baseline surveys in 2022 and then came back in 23 and 24. All right, so what did we find? Surprisingly, the understory birds were not adversely affected by and large. In fact, we saw a lot of species apparently increase in abundance or even presence. We had species that weren't present at these treatment sites prior to treatment that showed up after the treatment. So this was kind of a surprise, a good surprise. So the high level findings, we found 65 species at the Jenner Headlands Preserve sites, which included 22 focal species, 27 species at Pole Mountain, including 8 focal species, 29 species at Little Black Mountain, which included 13 focal species, and 39 species at Bear Canyon Wildlands, which included 12 focal species. And just really quick, one of the reasons why there are so many more species detected at Jenner Headlands Preserve is because we had 4 years of data, so we spent more time there, and also we covered more ground. Could be another explanation for why there were more species at Jenner Headlands. A larger study area overall. And the special status species we found included olive-sided flycatcher, Vox's swift, and purple martin. Purple martin is a California bird species of special concern. And there was no overall or overarching pattern, which made interpretation a little tricky, but I think that's a good thing, and actually it begs for more questions to be asked in follow-up studies. But the effects on species richness and abundance of focal species was very mixed. But overall, at the end of the day, the understory nesting guild was not adversely affected, which was a good thing. So this table on the right, just to interpret it a little bit, if you're wondering, the plus signs next to each species and falls under each of the 3 survey sites that from the Jenner Headlands Preserve. I'll show the Sonoma Land Trust sites in the next slide, but this is from the Jenner Headlands Preserve. The plus sign means that species abundance was significantly higher post-treatment surveys. If it's a plus with parentheses, it was a little higher, but not significantly. And then with the negative or negative with parentheses, same thing. Either it was less abundant or less abundant, but not significantly so. And then if it's blank, no change. And these are the results from the Sonoma Land Trust properties, Bear Canyon Wildlands, Little Black Mountain, and Pole Mountain. Again, no overarching pattern, and actually, it was not consistent across sites either. And the reason why I'm showing a picture of a golden eagle and a pileated woodpecker on the left is because these are two large charismatic species, and they were not detected in the baseline surveys, any of the properties. But then upon returning to Bear Canyon Wildlands, after a lot of the understory had been opened up more, um, it seemed like it created more space for these two large species to be able to use and forage. And so the pileated woodpecker was flying from tree to tree, exploring, trees that may not have been accessible to it before. And the golden eagle was just sort of soaring over the site and perched in a tree momentarily, then took off after that. I mean, it is just a sample size of one, but it was still noteworthy. And and maybe the pileated woodpecker is more telling because at least the one that I saw at Little Black Mountain, they could not have physically gotten into some of these sites and used them for foraging because it was so dense with that understory. It was like an understory thicket of dead Douglas fir branches. And so after those small Douglas fir branches were thinned out, the large birds like the pileated woodpecker could get in there and exploit that habitat for foraging. Another interesting finding with looking at the Jenner Headlands Preserve, where we had that 10-year interval between the baseline and the follow-up survey, was that there was a significant increase in species richness, which is species richness is simply the number of species detected. And this was true for all three sites, the Eastern Shaded Fuel Break, Western Shaded Fuel Break, and the Upper Russian Gulch. We did not see a significant change in species richness at the Sonoma Land Trust properties. But again, we didn't have that. That was just a 1 to 2 year interval between surveys. So it'd be very interesting at the Sonoma Land Trust sites, as opposed to the 10-year interval at the Jenner Headlands site. So it will be very interesting to be able to return back to the Sonoma Land Trust sites several years down the road and repeat these surveys and see what changes have happened. And so as I mentioned earlier, the results beg more questions. And for why were the understory birds not adversely affected? And I think there are several explanations for that. One is that a lot of these birds, that their territories are larger than the treatment area. Where, for example, the shaded fuel breaks at Jenner Headlands went, I think it was 150 feet on either side of the road, or maybe it was a 150-foot buffer altogether. But that essentially just creates more edge habitat, and it certainly did not. The treatment doesn't clear the forest by any means. It still left a healthy overstory. It did clear out a lot of those understory bushes that a bird might otherwise nest in, like the Wilson's warbler nesting in a sword fern. Um, but at the same time, having more edge habitat generally creates more of a habitat mosaic. It opens up more opportunities for foraging for more species. Um, and it it's worth commenting that we weren't doing nest monitoring, so that would be a whole other scale of a study where if we were actually looking for individual nests, we were just using bird presence and abundance as a proxy, if you will. And also that this was just a snapshot in time, and that forest management is ongoing, and so monitoring should be ongoing as well, just returning to these sites and seeing how the birds are doing as the vegetation may return where it had been cleared out. But if we look at the big picture, fuels management and what they were doing at these preserves, it's making the forest more resilient against wildfires. And so if it helps make the forest more resilient for wildfires, and that's beneficial for all the birds and all the other animals that depend on these forest ecosystems. And lastly, I'll say that this nexus between wildfire resilience and bird habitat, the overlap is a sweet spot where we can find we can build these partnerships between different organizations and find win-win outcomes for both wildlife ecosystems and resilience. And I'd like to thank the Sonoma Land Trust for organizing this webinar, and also Wildlands Conservancy and Ryan Berger for being here tonight, and the Cornell Lab for their funding of this project.
Thank you, Ryan. It was so fun to hear about our project all over again. I also want to just acknowledge that Ryan Berger actually took this presentation to the California Council of Land Trusts alongside Sarah Barker of the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. And so this is a really important conversation in Sonoma County, but also for all of the conservation groups across California. I'm going to have Ryan Berger talk a bit more about the specifics of forest management, and Ryan DiGaudio can talk about the specifics of the bird data, but I did see some questions about the understory shrubs and the granary trees and kind of some of the techniques that we used in our forest management. And I just want to pipe up to say that we did put special care and attention in our burn units to preserve granary trees. And it was an enormous amount of effort with CAL FIRE, actually like using McLeods to take all the slough away from the base of these trees. And they actually hosed down one of these trees during one of our burns because we knew that a snag at the edge of a burn unit was going to go up like a candle. So I just want to credit all of our partners for being on board with our conservation mission and doing burns for ecological health. And with that, Ryan, both Ryans, you're both unmuted. Do you want to take some of these questions?
Yeah, thanks, Shanti. I'm happy to. Maybe the first one that Charles asked was related to regarding thin and release and what do you do with non-merchantable material? Obviously, the concern around carbon and CO2 produced. Great question. A couple things that we did to address that issue was one, we have a portable mill on site. So any of the smaller diameter trees that did not go to the mill itself, we have actually milled and put directly back into our preserve. Buildings shifted up to the Eel River Canyon to build fencing and decking. We've also taken a lot of our scraps and other small diameter, and we've given that to the Kashaya Band of Pono Indians so that they could build the roundhouses up at their reservation near Fort Ross. And then I think the other, whatever's laying on the ground, we have come back through to treat the material that's on the ground through mastication so that we get those pieces of wood, those larger pieces, into smaller pieces and let that decay over time. And then that'll be a more gentler burn when we do have prescribed fire come through with CAL FIRE.
All right. That's great. So there was a question about the understory retention specs for shaded fuel breaks and fuels management. And I actually put great care and attention to flag a bunch of the shrubs and actually some of the oak seedlings and elderberry and there were a whole gooseberry. There's just a whole bunch of species that are important for the kind of mix of habitat qualities. And we didn't want to lose that with the fuels management. So there was a lot of flagging and different colors of tape that we put up and then we had to take down. But we knew that we wanted to identify the species that we wanted to retain. And so I actually want to credit Harold Appleton. I don't know if he's in the audience, but he was alongside me in all of these projects. Ryan D, there's a bunch of questions about well, edge habitat and other variables that can affect a bird population size.
Okay. I'll start with edge habitat. It's easier.
Yeah.
Edge habitat simply the interface where one habitat abuts against another. At least that's how I think of it. I think, in a forest setting, it's the edge is where a clearing would meet the edge of the woods. And then there are nuances. You can call it ecotone, where you have like the edges kind of blend from one habitat type to another. So you might have like a forest that transitions to a shrub that transitions to more of like open grassland. But I think for when I was talking about edge habitat along the shaded fuel breaks, I meant sort of abrupt change between the thick untreated or dense untreated understory and where the understory had been thinned and relatively clear right at that interface. So other significant variables that can affect a bird population size, it's there are many. I mean, there are lots of factors, especially for migratory birds. We don't know exactly what happens when they're transiting on their way during migration. There's a lot of hazards. People that even bright buildings in tall buildings can attract birds during migration and cause mortality when they crash into them. House cats, as many people are aware, are one of the most significant factors, like human, quote unquote, human caused factors. Deforestation and on their wintering grounds is a factor. Pesticides in some locations can be a factor. Um, yeah, and also climate change is increasingly becoming a factor. And when we look at how climate change is exacerbating the frequency and intensity of wildfires, that's definitely impacting their habitat and also affecting their populations. See, were there any relationships between species abundance post-treatment and their nesting type for diet? I'm going to say no, because overall there was no consistent pattern in terms of which birds increased and which birds declined, with the exception maybe the quail were ground nesters and they stick to the ground. Both California mountain quails, I think they all increased in abundance at almost every site. At least that was true at Jenner Headlands.
Ryan, do you want to talk a bit about the study design and the fact that we didn't have like the same treatments across all the properties and there were different types of forest conditions at different with different climatic conditions. And we really weren't doing this at a research level, but we wanted to just, for an adaptive management approach, understand how our forest management was affecting bird populations. And so I invite you, both Ryans, to chime in on that, but this wasn't a very rigorous science-based study that because of the scale of the work and just needing to see some results. So we were thankful for the partnerships that enabled us.
Yeah. So in a more, I guess, ideal situation, we would have had replicate plots and control plots that were adjacent to the treatment plots. But we were limited in what we could do, just in terms of what, funding and capacity was available. And so to Shanti's point, we wanted to get some data that was be useful for informing management. I should add that this is an active area of research. We're not the only ones looking at this. In fact, there's another group at Point Blue that just wrapped up a pretty, I would say, more comprehensive study with many more years of data, and so they applied some more serious statistics to it. Here in Marin County, looking at the Mount Tam watershed at Marin Municipal Water District land, where we've been doing bird monitoring every 3 years since 1996. And they recently went through their own fuels management reduction program. And they basically had this, they had the same conclusions, same findings, maybe not species by species, but the overall effects were leaned towards neutral to positive on birds. So that was encouraging to see that we agreed on our findings.
Yeah, and I'll chime in there, Shanti and Ryan. I know, Ryan, when we were providing some of these results, you were very clear that this likely isn't a publishable, paper or data that we have. A lot of it is quantitative in the sense, finding some interesting trends and poses more questions to build on for future. Because I think there are a lot of great questions that are being asked about, the different types of methods between a thin and release versus shaded fuel break or chipping and lop and scatter. Did all the areas get prescribed burns? And we did not dive in the details that way. Those are really great questions. And I think if it was designed to look at it in that way, there's the potential to go back there. I'll say anecdotally, it's really impressive how the forest has responded after we did the thin and release, from the vegetation to the plant or the birds and animal species. We saw shortly after time, Douglas iris, redwood sorrel, the various species of ferns, wild rose, a lot of those native plants came right back to the forest floor that had not been there before, which was really inspiring and promising to see. And then we had other benefits that relate to fewer trees falling over roads for maintenance purposes, the roads drying out faster because more wind and light were hitting it. So it's helped us in terms of just our overall maintenance and stewardship of the preserve itself. But certainly if we were going to publish this, we'd want to set up, experimental plots and everything too. But good questions.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan.
Go for it.
Yeah, well, there's this question about since many folks think we need to treat lots more acres than just fuel breaks, given size of bird territories, will this be relevant to larger areas? Yeah, I mean, I guess I know in the Sierra Nevada, they are doing fuels treatments on a much grander scale. And yeah, so our results may not be as relevant to areas that are treated on the scale of, thousands of acres.
Yeah, along those lines, I heard a talk with Megan Waller-Murphy asking about or discussing how these dense forest conditions are really great for bear habitat. And there was another question in the chat about mountain lion habitat and the need for dense vegetative cover. And I think in general, we're taking in the approach of just a kind of a patchwork or mosaic approach of chipping away at focusing on roadsides and areas that are important for wildfire response, for community safety, and then kind of working out from there. And so I think there might be more of a kind of intensive approach along roadsides for visual clearance and safety, but then we're increasingly switching to more of an approach of kind of having like different variable burn effects and different levels of fuels management within a unit, so that if you do pile burning, you can strategically pile fuels so that when you do a broadcast burn, you can affect fire intensity in that manner and nudge the species you want to kind of keep or reduce in that way. And so in some ways, we're now using fire like kind of like in a more surgical manner than we were able to before, because of what we're learning as a collective kind of forest management community. And so I don't think that we would wholesale like burn the entire North Coast all at once. And we're all thinking about intervals, and we're guided by the VTP and kind of the vegetation types and kind of the science behind a fire ecology with this work. So I think that's what I would say about that.
Thanks, Shanti. I'll quickly add, I know Quentin had asked specifically about LiDAR, and I would say that's probably the best bet to get large scale um, vegetation data for what you're talking about. And we do have a series of wildlife cameras too. And an interesting question that I have in mind is like, what differences are we seeing throughout the camera systems that we have set up across the preserve in some of the treated areas versus untreated areas? And we'd be happy to share any of the mountain lion data that we have. It is time consuming to go through. And then to Shanti's point too, a lot of the work that we do, whether it was the forest management work or it's the prescribed burning that follows, is outside of sensitive nesting time for birds and the important time windows for those birds. So we are following those guidelines through CEQA and want to make sure that we continue to do that.
So there's a question about chipping materials and other kind of biomass methods, like piles versus lop and scatter on ground nesting birds. And so I'll let Ryan DiGaudio talk about like specific habitat needs for those birds and kind of how we are altering the kind of structure and kind of composition of these areas, but kind of where the sweet spot might be for combining our forest management toolkit with a lens for bird conservation. Or either of you actually want to talk about that.
So we didn't really go into specific methods like chipping materials on site or removing or lop and scatter piles were burned. But I would say that brush piles, if brush piles could be left in strategic locations that weren't reducing fire resiliency, going counter to the objective of creating more fire resiliency, that brush piles could be beneficial for a number of birds, especially wintering sparrows or nesting wrens. Yeah, no, that's a good question. I hadn't really thought about the fuels removal like process and how that could affect birds.
I'll just chime in and say that we typically do all of this fuels management work, whether it's mechanical thinning or prescribed burning or pile burning. We always do it outside of bird nesting season. So that actually starts September 1st. So if you all live in rural areas, you might be hearing the chainsaws in your regional wildland areas, because this is kind of a focused time of work, with kind of after the first rains being more optimal, where we're within the burn prescription for a more like, optimal fire. So that's the way that we protect birds through our efforts to, manage the fuels. So I'll let the two Ryans to kind of sift through. If there's more to talk about. I think there was a question about Hutton's vireos and whether they decreased in most places and whether they have smaller territories than other species.
Yeah, they don't have huge territories, is my impression. I'd have to go back and look at the data. Let's see if I can scroll back here. Let's see, our Hutton's vireos here. Hutton's vireo, yes, they did decline. So this would be a good species to look at, connecting it to somebody else's question, whether we look at regional BBS data. So BBS, if you're not familiar, stands for Breeding Bird Survey. It's a long-term data set that covers all of North America, I think. So that would be the next level, is to look at to see if these patterns are more region-wide and not just specific to our study sites. So that could help us tease apart some of the effects.
And Shanti, I see a question in the chat too about the shaded fuel breaks going through repairing areas and if there were any different treatments or monitoring in that area. Less sure, Ryan, if there were bird surveys through those areas, but in our forest management, we did take those into account. So either they were off limits, depending on the class of stream that they were running through, and we didn't harvest through there, or there are other limitations where we didn't treat as heavy because we wanted to keep those riparian habitats intact.
Definitely, and riparian vegetation is lush and it's not really as much of a fire risk, and so we typically mark off those areas with flagging and just avoid them altogether. So I think we did a pretty great run through on these questions, and I just so appreciate the conversation that we shared tonight. I want to thank our two presenters, Ryan DiGaudio and Ryan Berger, and for just continuing the conversation. And I invite you to reach out. Here's our contact information, and we'd be happy to discuss further. But with that, I'll say thank you and good night.